Get your things. You're coming home. 5 words that shattered a widow's despair and a hermit's solitude. When ex-Marshal Joshua Miller heard gunfire pierce the Montana blizzard, he had 2 choices. Ignore it like he'd ignored the world for 3 years, or break his vow of isolation. What he found in that collapsing cabin, a mother defending her starving children with empty hands, would drag him back into the fight he'd sworn to abandon forever. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and stay until the end. Comment which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The gunshot cracked through the frozen air like bone breaking. Joshua Miller's axe stopped mid-swing blade buried deep in pine. He stood there in his woodpile breath, clouding white, listening to the silence that followed. Then another shot punched through the afternoon. Then shouting male voices rough with whiskey and entitlement. 3 years. 3 years of chopping wood and keeping his head down, and now this. He should walk away. That's what he did now. That's who he'd become. The third shot made him move. His rifle came off the cabin wall, and the weight of it settled into his hands like a piece of his soul he'd tried to bury. He moved through the snow with the practiced silence of a man who'd hunted worse than animals through worse than winter. The trees blurred past. His boots found solid ground by instinct. Behind him, his axe stayed buried in the stump forgotten. The Bennett cabin came into view through the pines, one wall sagging inward like a broken rib, smoke limping from a chimney that looked ready to collapse. 4 horses stood outside, too expensive for this part of Montana. Their breath steamed in the cold air. Joshua circled wide, using the tree line for cover. Through the gaps in the weathered logs, he could hear them now. "Don't care what you think you're owed." A woman's voice sharp, with the kind of desperation that came from having nothing left to lose. "I got nothing to give you." "Your husband thought different when he signed this." Young male voice, educated the kind that had never been punched in the mouth. $200, Mrs. Bennett, due last November. He's dead. Thomas is dead, and you know it. Makes no difference to the debt. It passes to you. That's contract law. Joshua reached the north wall and pressed against it. Through a gap in the chinking, he got his first clear look inside. Sarah Bennett stood in the center of that one-room cabin like a warrior with no weapons. Behind her, 2 children huddled together, a boy who couldn't be more than 8, wheezing with each breath, and a girl, maybe 12, gripping her brother's hand so tight her knuckles had gone white. 4 men crowded the small space. The speaker wore a coat that cost more than most families made in half a year. James Wallace. Joshua knew the name, even if he'd never spoken to the man. Banker's son. The kind who thought money made him bulletproof. Behind Wallace, 3 hired men with the dead eyes of people who'd stopped asking questions about right and wrong. "I'll give you 1 week, Wallace said, taking a step closer to Sarah. 1 week to find $200, or I take what's owed." "Take what?" Sarah's laugh came out like broken glass. "Look around you. I got a table with 3 legs and a roof that leaks when it rains." Wallace's smile never reached his eyes. "You got land. Half an acre. That'll cover the debt and interest." "This land's worthless. No water rights, no timber value." "Not my problem, Mrs. Bennett. That's business." Wallace turned toward his men. "Mark it down in the book. 1 week, or we file for seizure." That's when the boy coughed a wet, rattling sound that made Joshua's chest tighten like a fist was squeezing his lungs. The kid doubled over, fighting for air that wouldn't come. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, one hand on his back. "Tommy, breathe for me, baby. Just breathe." "What's wrong with him?" one of the hired men asked, stepping back like the kid's suffering might be catching. "Asthma," Sarah said, still rubbing circles on the boy's back. "The cold makes it worse. Please, Mr. Wallace, just give me more time." 1 week. Wallace moved toward the door. Sarah did something then that made Joshua's finger find his trigger. She grabbed Wallace's boot with both hands. "Please." The word came out broken. "Please, he needs medicine. Doc Abernathy says there's a treatment from Denver that might help him breathe better, but it costs money I don't have. If you take this land, we got nowhere to go. Tommy won't survive another winter out here. Please." Wallace looked down at her like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. Then he kicked free, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to make his point. Sarah sprawled backward on the dirt floor. The girl screamed. "Mama!" Joshua came through that door like Judgment Day arriving early. The rifle appeared first barrel steady, pointing at the space between Wallace's eyes. 4 heads snapped around. 4 sets of eyes went wide. "Gentlemen," Joshua said, his voice quiet in a way that made it more dangerous. "The lady asked you to leave." Wallace recovered faster than Joshua expected. "Privilege did, that made you stupid and brave in equal measure." "This is private business, mister. You need to move along." "Can't do that." "Do you have any idea who my father is?" "Don't care who your father is. Don't care who you are. You're leaving. Only question left is whether you walk out or get carried." One of the hired men, the one with a scar across his jaw, let his hand drift toward his hip. Joshua's rifle shifted maybe 1 degree, just enough. "I wouldn't," Joshua said. "I'm old and my hands shake sometimes from an old war wound. Might miss what I'm aiming at. Might hit something you need, like your face." The hand froze. Wallace's cheeks flushed red. "You're making a serious mistake. My father is Judge Thaddeus Wallace. He owns half this county. You put that rifle down right now, or what?" Joshua took 1 step forward. In the small cabin, it was enough to make Wallace take 1 step back. "You'll write my name in your little book. You'll have your daddy come talk to me. Go ahead. But right now, I'm the one with the rifle, and you're the one who just kicked a woman in front of her children. So I'm going to ask one more time, real polite. Leave." The silence stretched. Tommy wheezed. Sarah stayed on the floor, one arm wrapped around her daughter. The stove crackled. Finally, Wallace laughed cold and sharp, the kind of laugh that promised future pain. All right, we're leaving." He looked past Joshua to Sarah. "1 week, Mrs. Bennett. When I come back, I'm bringing Sheriff Thompson and the paperwork. You can either pay what's owed, or you can watch us take this property. Your choice." He gestured to his men, and they filed out. Joshua stayed in the doorway, rifle ready, watching them mount their expensive horses. Watching them ride into the gray afternoon hoofbeats fading into the distance. He didn't move until the sound disappeared completely. Didn't lower the rifle until there was nothing but wind, and the boys labored breathing. Then he turned around. Sarah had pulled herself up, both children pressed against her sides. Her dress was dirty from the floor. Her hair had come loose from its pins. But her eyes were dry in that terrible way that meant she'd already cried herself empty. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know who you are, but thank you." Joshua looked around the cabin properly now. Really looked. 1 room, maybe 12 feet on a side. Dirt floor packed hard from use. A cast-iron stove that looked held together by rust and prayer. 1 window with oiled paper instead of glass. In the corner, what passed for beds, straw mattresses so thin he could see the floorboards through them. His eyes landed on the table. 3 tin plates with scraps rabbit bones that had been boiled at least twice for soup, some kind of root vegetable gone soft and gray. A half loaf of bread so hard it could be used as a weapon. They were eating garbage. "How long?" he asked. "I'm sorry. How long have you been out here alone?" Sarah lifted her chin, and he watched pride fight shame across her face. Pride won, but barely. "My husband Thomas died 4 months ago. Cave-in at the Silver Creek mine. We've been managing since then." Managing. That word hung in the air between them like a lie they both knew was breaking. Tommy coughed again, that wet, drowning sound that spoke of lungs filling with fluid they couldn't expel. The boy's lips had a blue tinge around the edges. "Emma." The girl looked at Joshua with eyes that had seen too much, understood too much, aged too fast. "You got family?" Joshua asked. "Anyone in town who might help?" "No." "Friends?" Sarah's silence answered that question. Joshua moved to the sagging wall and tested it with 1 hand. The whole structure shifted. A few more weeks, maybe less, and this place would collapse inward like a house of cards. You got wood for that stove? Some. Enough for maybe another week if we're careful. Food? Enough. Don't lie to me, ma'am. Sarah's jaw tightened. Enough for the children. I make do. Joshua felt something crack inside his chest, something he'd thought he'd successfully frozen 3 years ago. He looked at the children again, at Tommy wheezing and blue-lipped, at Emma trying so hard to be brave, at Sarah standing there like a fortress built on sand. He thought about his own cabin, 5 miles north through the pines, warm, solid, empty except for ghosts that wouldn't leave and memories that wouldn't fade. He'd sworn 3 years ago that he'd never get involved again, never let anyone close enough to matter, close enough to lose. But Tommy wheezed again, and Joshua heard a different child's breathing. 3 years gone, but never really silent. Get your things, he heard himself say. Sarah blinked. What? Get your things. You're coming home. We can't just... Yes, you can. Joshua moved back to the wall, gave it another test. More creaking. This place won't last another week. Maybe not another strong wind. That boy needs warm and dry. Needs it tonight, not next week. I don't even know your name. Joshua Miller. I got a ranch 5 miles north of here. Solid cabin with a real roof. Warm stove that doesn't leak smoke. Room enough for a family. Why? Sarah's voice cracked on the word. Why would you help people you don't even know? Joshua looked at her for a long moment. He could have lied, could have said something about Christian duty or neighborly kindness, but her eyes demanded truth, and he found he didn't have the energy for anything else. Because I can, he said simply. And because 3 years ago, I wasn't there when people needed me. Can't fix that. But I can fix this. I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. We're complete strangers. Won't be for long. Joshua turned to Emma. Can you pack? The girl nodded slowly. Good. Pack warm clothes first. Whatever food you got left, blankets, anything that matters. You got 10 minutes. Mama! Emma looked at her mother confused and hopeful and scared all at once. Sarah stared at Joshua like he was a fever dream that might disappear if she blinked. Her hands were shaking. Then Tommy coughed again, harder this time, his whole small body convulsing with it, and something in Sarah's face crumbled and reformed harder. Emma, she said quietly, do what Mr. Miller says. The next 10 minutes moved fast. They owned almost nothing, some clothes, more patches than fabric, a few tin dishes, a photograph in a cracked wooden frame. Sarah wrapped Tommy in every blanket they had, while Emma stuffed a flour sack with their possessions. The girl moved with surprising efficiency, making quick decisions about what mattered and what didn't. Joshua found himself watching them. These people he'd known for less than an hour. Sarah's hands were rough with work, her dress patched and repatched, but she moved with a kind of fierce grace, a determination that spoke of battles fought and not yet lost. He checked the western horizon through the window. The sun was dropping fast, and with it went what little warmth the day had held. In the west, clouds were building dark and heavy, the kind that meant snow. Not the gentle kind, the killing kind. Storm's coming, he said. We need to move now. Sarah lifted Tommy into her arms. The boy had stopped wheezing, but Joshua knew that might be worse. Sometimes they stopped fighting right before they stopped breathing. Can you walk? He asked Emma. Yes, sir. Her voice was small but steady. Good. Stay close to me. Don't stop unless I say stop. If the wind picks up, we keep moving anyway. You understand? Both Emma and Sarah nodded. All right then. Joshua shouldered their single flour sack. It weighed almost nothing. He grabbed his rifle and opened the door. The cold hit them like a physical blow. The first mile went easy enough. The wind stayed low, the snow held off, and Joshua set a pace he thought they could maintain, not fast, but steady. He glanced back every 30 seconds or so, making sure they kept up. Emma walked with grim determination, her thin coat buttoned to her chin. Sarah carried Tommy like he weighed nothing like maternal love could compensate for muscle and strength. The boy's head lolled against her shoulder. The second mile the wind woke up. It came from the north like something with teeth sharp enough to cut through their clothes and fine skin. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 10 minutes. Sarah stumbled over a hidden root, caught herself, kept moving. "How much farther?" she called out, her voice barely carrying over the wind. 3 miles. He watched her face go pale, but she nodded and kept walking. That impressed him. No complaints, no hesitation. Just grim acceptance and forward motion. The third mile the snow started. Not gentle flakes drifting down like in children's stories. This was Montana winter, showing its teeth, hard driving snow that came horizontal in the wind, erasing the world one white curtain at a time. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. Then 10. Joshua knew these mountains, knew them in summer and winter, day and night. He could navigate them blind if he had to. But even he had to slow down now, checking landmarks that disappeared as fast as he found them. "Mr. Miller?" Emma's voice thin and scared. He turned. The girl had fallen, was struggling to get up. Her hands were shaking too badly to find purchase in the snow. Sarah couldn't help. She had Tommy, and the boy was dead weight now, unconscious or close to it. Joshua backtracked, grabbed Emma's arm, pulled her to her feet. Her hands were ice cold even through her gloves. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm trying. I promise I'm trying." "I know you are." Joshua made a decision. He took Tommy from Sarah's arms, settled the boy against his chest with one arm. The kid was burning up with fever despite the cold. "You hold your mama's hand now. Both of you follow my footprints exactly. Step where I step. Don't go anywhere else. Understand? Your rifle." Sarah started. "Forget the rifle." Joshua's voice was firm. "Won't do us any good if we freeze. Just follow me. Don't think. Don't look around. Just follow." He started walking again, slower now, testing each step. Behind him, Sarah and Emma held on to each other, stumbling forward because stopping meant dying, and they all knew it. The fourth mile nearly killed them. The wind became something alive, something with personality and malice. It screamed through the pines like a creature hunting. It threw snow in their faces like fists. Joshua's world narrowed to the next step, then the next. Tommy's shallow breathing against his chest, the only thing that told him the boy was still alive. His feet had gone numb 20 minutes ago. His face felt like leather stretched too tight. But he kept moving because stopping wasn't an option, because 3 people were depending on him, because he'd failed before and couldn't fail again. Behind him, Sarah and Emma held each other upright, moving forward on nothing but will. Then Emma fell again. This time, she didn't get up. Just lay there in the snow, done. "I can't," she sobbed. "I'm sorry, I can't." "Yes, you can." Joshua's voice was hard as iron. "Get up." "I can't feel my feet." "Don't need to feel them. Just need to move them. Get up." Something in his voice, maybe the command, maybe the absolute certainty, made Emma push herself up one more time. Sarah grabbed her daughter's arm, and they started moving again. That's when Joshua's cabin appeared, through the white curtain of snow, like salvation made of logs and timber. "There!" he shouted over the wind. "See it 50 yards!" Those 50 yards took an eternity. Each step was a separate battle against snow that had drifted knee-deep in places. But finally, they staggered onto the porch. Joshua kicked the door open, and they burst inside. The cabin was dark and cold, but compared to outside, it felt like paradise. Joshua laid Tommy on his bed, an actual bed, with a real mattress, not straw on the floor. His hands moved on autopilot muscle memory from years of frontier living. Light the lamp, stoke the stove, grab blankets. "Get by the fire," he told Sarah and Emma. "Get those wet clothes off right now. Don't argue. Just do it." He turned his attention to Tommy. The boy's breathing was so shallow it barely moved his chest. His lips had gone from blue to gray. Joshua stripped off the wet layers with practiced efficiency, wrapped him in dry wool blankets, held him close to share body heat. "Come on, kid," he muttered. "Come on. You didn't walk 4 miles through hell to quit now. Breathe." Sarah appeared beside him, still shivering but functional. "Let me." She took her son, began rubbing his arms, his legs, his chest, trying to force warmth and circulation back into his small body. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer. Emma huddled by the stove, wrapped in a blanket, crying silently. Joshua put coffee on to boil, added whiskey to 3 tin cups, a small amount to Emma's more, to Sarah's most, to his own. They drank in silence, listening to the storm rage outside and Tommy's labored breathing inside. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Then Tommy stirred, coughed. His eyelids fluttered. Color began seeping back into his lips, slow but steady. Sarah made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "He's warming up. Oh God, he's going to be okay." Joshua nodded and turned away before she could see his face, see whatever was written there. He busied himself at the stove, putting together a meal from what he had: salt pork beans, actual bread. Not much, but more than they'd seen in months, probably. They were halfway through eating when the pounding started. Not knocking. Pounding. Fists on wood, aggressive and demanding. "Joshua Miller, open this door." Joshua's hand found his rifle where it leaned against the wall. He looked at Sarah and watched her face drain of color. "You know that voice?" he asked quietly. "Judge Wallace?" she whispered. "James's father." Of course it was. Joshua moved to the door, rifle in one hand. "It's late, Judge. Storm's getting worse. State your business." "Open this door, Miller. I won't ask twice." Joshua opened it, but only a crack rifle barrel visible in the gap. Outside stood Judge Thaddeus Wallace, 6 feet of iron-gray authority, wrapped in an expensive fur-lined coat that probably cost more than Joshua's entire cabin. Behind him, Sheriff Thompson looked deeply uncomfortable, his hand resting on his gun belt, more out of habit than threat. "Judge," Joshua said, his voice neutral, "what brings you out in weather like this?" "You're harboring fugitives, Miller. Trespassers." The judge's voice was all courtroom authority and frontier power. "My son filed a formal complaint. Mrs. Bennett and her children are in violation of their contract and their lease. They have no right to be here or anywhere else until their debts are settled." "Your son's a liar." The judge's eyes went flat and cold. "Watch yourself." "I am watching. Watching you ride up to my cabin in a blizzard to threaten a widow and 2 children. Makes a man wonder what you're really afraid of, Judge. Makes him wonder what's worth riding out in killing weather." "The law?" "The law says a man can offer shelter to people in need. The law says children don't freeze to death over their father's debts. You want to discuss law. Judge, I'm happy to do that, but not tonight. Tonight these people are my guests, and they're not going anywhere." Sheriff Thompson cleared his throat. "Maybe we should come back in the morning, Judge. This storm's getting worse, and—" "Morning will be fine," Joshua interrupted. "Bring your paperwork. Bring your lawyers. Hell, bring your son if you want. But tonight these people stay here in the warm where they belong." Wallace stared at him for a long moment. "You're making a powerful enemy, Miller." "Made worse." Joshua kept his voice level, almost bored. "And I'm still standing. Good night, Judge." He closed the door, locked it with the iron bar, stood there listening until he heard horses leaving their hoofbeats muffled by snow. When he turned around, Sarah was standing in the middle of the room with Tommy in her arms, tears streaming down her face. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "The Wallaces, they own half this county. The judge controls the courts. They'll destroy you for this. They'll take everything you have." Joshua shrugged. "Let them try." "Why?" Her voice broke. "Why would you risk everything for people you don't even know? For people you met 2 hours ago?" Joshua looked at Tommy, sleeping peaceful now in his mother's arms. Looked at Emma curled by the fire with eyes that were starting to trust him. Looked at Sarah, brave and broken, and still fighting. Because 3 years ago, he said quietly, I wasn't there when people needed me. I was chasing outlaws that didn't matter in the long run. Came home to find my wife and son dead from fever. No one there to help them. No one to fetch the doctor or bring medicine or just be there. He paused. I live with that every day. Every single day. So maybe I can't fix the past. Maybe I can't bring them back. But I can fix tonight. I can be here now. Sarah nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. What do we do in the morning when they come back? Morning, we figure out what Wallace really wants. Joshua moved to the window, stared out at the white darkness and the storm that showed no signs of stopping. Because men like him don't ride out in blizzards over $200 and a worthless half-acre. There's something else going on. Something bigger. Like what? Don't know yet. Joshua turned back to face her. But we're going to find out. Together. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, Mr. Miller. Joshua. Joshua. She said his name carefully, like she was testing its weight. Have we met before? Something about you seems familiar. Joshua studied her face, really looked at her for the first time. Mid-30s, he guessed. Brown hair shot through with premature gray. Lines around her eyes from squinting into sun and worry. But there was something in the shape of her face, the way she held herself. Where are you from originally? He asked. Pennsylvania. Little town outside Gettysburg. She shifted Tommy in her arms. I worked as a nurse during the war. Battlefield hospitals mostly after the fighting moved through. Joshua went very still. Gettysburg. Yes. Why? He moved to the mantel, pushed aside some dust, pulled down a small tin daguerreotype. Opened it. Looked at it for a long moment, before turning it around to show her. The image was faded but clear enough, a younger Joshua in Union blue one arm, in a sling standing next to a woman in a nurse's apron. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. That's me. Oh my God, that's me. July 1863. Joshua said. I took shrapnel in my shoulder. Field hospital. You worked on me for 3 days while I had fever. Kept telling me stories to keep me awake. Stories about wanting to go west after the war, wanting to see mountains. You said you were a marshal from Montana. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You promised if I ever made it west, you'd show me the Rockies. Promised a lot of things back then. Joshua set the daguerreotype back on the mantel. War changes people. Life changes them more. I looked for you, Sarah said. After the war, before I met Thomas. Wrote to the marshal's office in Helena. They said you'd resigned. No forwarding address. I resigned after my family died. Moved up here. Stopped answering letters. Stopped a lot of things. Sarah looked at him with new understanding. So that's why. That's why you helped us. Because of a promise made 22 years ago. No. Joshua's voice was firm. I helped you because it was right. Because you needed help and I could give it. The past. He gestured at the daguerreotype. The past just explains why it hurt so much to say yes. They stood there in silence for a moment, history settling between them like snow. Then Tommy coughed softer now, easier, and the spell broke. You should sleep, Joshua said. Take the bed with Tommy. Emma can have the cot by the fire. I'll take the floor. I can't take your bed. You can and you will. I've slept in worse places. He pulled blankets from a chest, started making a pallet on the floor. We got a hard day coming tomorrow. Whatever Wallace wants, he wants it bad. Bad enough to come out in a storm. That means we need to be ready. Sarah nodded slowly. She carried Tommy to the bed, tucked Emma onto the cot. Both children were already asleep, exhausted beyond measure. She stood there for a moment looking at Joshua in the lamplight. "Thank you," she said finally. "For everything. For saving us. For remembering." "Get some sleep, Sarah." She nodded and moved to the bed, lay down beside her son. Joshua stretched out on his floor pallet, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the fire crackled. And for the first time in 3 years, Joshua Miller's cabin held something other than ghosts and guilt. It held people worth protecting. People he'd already failed once 22 years ago by not answering that letter, by not being there when she came west. He wouldn't fail them again. Whatever Judge Wallace wanted, whatever game he was playing, Joshua would figure it out. And he'd stop it. Because that's what he did. That's what he'd always done before grief made him forget. He was a marshal. Maybe not officially anymore. But some things you didn't resign from. Some things were in your blood. Outside, the storm screamed its rage at the mountains. Inside, Joshua Miller closed his eyes and for the first time in 3 years slept without nightmares. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, they were safe. They were warm. They were together. And sometimes, that was enough. And morning came with silence. Joshua woke to that particular quality of quiet that meant fresh snow had fallen heavy overnight. He lay there on his floor pallet for a moment, listening to the soft breathing of 3 other people in his cabin, a sound he hadn't heard in 3 years. Sarah and Tommy in the bed, Emma on the cot, all still asleep. He rose carefully, added wood to the stove without making noise, put coffee on. His body ached in places he'd forgotten could ache. Carrying a sick child 4 miles through a blizzard would do that to a man, especially one who'd spent 3 years doing nothing more strenuous than chopping wood. The window showed him a world transformed. 2 feet of fresh snow, maybe more. The sky had cleared to that hard blue that promised bitter cold. His woodpile was buried. The path to the barn was gone. And coming up that vanished path, 3 horses moved through the deep snow. Judge Wallace, Sheriff Thompson, and a 3rd man. Joshua didn't recognize tall, thin, carrying a leather satchel. A lawyer, probably. Joshua had maybe 5 minutes before they reached the cabin. He moved to the bed, touched Sarah's shoulder gently. She woke instantly, the way people did when they'd spent months sleeping, light always listening for danger. "They're here," he said quietly. Sarah sat up, careful not to wake Tommy. "Already?" "3 of them. The judge, the sheriff, and someone else. Probably a lawyer." "What do we do?" "We listen. We stay calm. And we figure out what they really want." Joshua handed her a cup of coffee. "Get dressed. Wake Emma. I'll handle the door." 5 minutes later, the pounding came. Joshua opened it before they could knock a second time. The 3 men stood on his porch, snow to their knees, breath steaming. "Gentlemen," Joshua said, "coffee's on if you want it." Judge Wallace brushed past him without invitation, tracking snow across the floor. The sheriff followed, looking apologetic. The lawyer came last, wiping his spectacles. "Mrs. Bennett?" The judge's voice filled the small cabin. "I'm here in my official capacity as circuit judge to inform you that your lease on the Bennett property is hereby terminated due to non-payment of debts. You have until sundown to vacate these premises." "These aren't her premises," Joshua said. "This is my cabin. She's my guest. Guest or not, she's still in violation." The judge pulled a paper from his coat. "This is a writ of seizure for the Bennett property and all assets therein. Sheriff Thompson will execute it at noon today." Sarah stood beside the bed, one hand on Tommy's shoulder. The boy was awake now, watching with wide, frightened eyes. Emma pressed against her mother's other side. "There's nothing there to seize," Sarah said. "You've seen the cabin. It's falling apart. The land has no value." "The land has the value I assign it." The judge's smile was cold. "And I'm assigning it sufficient value to cover your late husband's debts." "This is about more than debt." Joshua stepped between the judge and Sarah. "What do you really want, Wallace?" "I want what's legally owed. You rode out in a blizzard last night for $200. Try again." The judge's eyes narrowed. Careful, Miller. I'm done being careful. You want that land for something. Something your son mentioned yesterday, probably. Something worth more than a widow's half-acre. The lawyer, a nervous man named Pemberton Joshua, would learn later, cleared his throat. The Northern Pacific Railroad has expressed interest in a route through this valley. The Bennett property sits on the proposed right-of-way. Judge Wallace, in his capacity as County Land Commissioner, is authorized to acquire necessary properties for public infrastructure. There it was. Joshua felt something click into place. Public infrastructure, he repeated. That's a fancy way of saying you're stealing her land to sell to the railroad. It's not stealing when it's legal, the judge said. Legal doesn't mean right. Right doesn't pay debts. The judge turned back to Sarah. You have until sundown, Mrs. Bennett. If you're not off that property by then, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. She won't be there, Joshua said. She'll be here. That's her choice. But the land is forfeit either way. The judge moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Miller. You posted yourself as guarantor for these people last night. That means if they cause any trouble, you're liable. Keep that in mind. The three men left horses struggling back through the snow. Joshua closed the door and turned to find Sarah staring at him. The railroad, she said. Thomas knew. That's why. She stopped, her face going pale. That's why what Sarah moved to the flour sack they'd brought last night, dug through it, pulled out a small leather journal. Her hands shook as she opened it. Thomas kept notes, she said. The last few months before he died. He said men were coming around the mine asking questions about land, offering money for properties. He thought something was wrong with the offers. They were too low, too aggressive. She flipped pages. He wrote it all down. Names, dates, amounts offered. Joshua took the journal, scanned the pages. Thomas Bennett had been thorough. 3 months of notes about railroad agents making low-ball offers for land. About miners who refused to sell, suddenly facing accidents or having their claims disputed. About a surveyor who disappeared after questioning the proposed route. Did your husband tell anyone about this? Joshua asked. He tried. He went to the sheriff first, but Thompson said it was civil matter, not criminal. Then he tried Judge Wallace. Sarah's voice broke. 2 days later there was the cave-in. Thomas and 4 other men died. You think it wasn't an accident? I don't know what to think. Thomas was careful. He'd been mining for 15 years, and then suddenly... She wiped her eyes. Then suddenly I'm a widow with debts I didn't know existed, and men at my door demanding money I don't have. Joshua studied the journal. Something didn't fit. If the railroad wanted your land, why not just make you an offer? Why go through all this? Because there are 15 properties on that route, said a new voice from the doorway. They all turned. A man stood there, medium height, gray beard, holding a black medical bag. He'd come in so quietly none of them had heard. Doc Abernathy, Sarah said. How did you buy? Saw Wallace riding out at dawn, figured he was heading here. The doctor moved to the stove, poured himself coffee without asking. Mind if I check on the boy while we talk? Sarah nodded, and Doc Abernathy moved to Tommy, began a quick examination. The boy submitted quietly, used to doctors by now. You said 15 properties, Joshua prompted. That's right. The proposed railroad route cuts through 15 properties in this valley. Wallace and the railroad, they've got a deal. Wallace acquires the land cheap through foreclosure and legal manipulation, then sells it to the railroad at market rate. He keeps the difference. That's fraud, Joshua said. That's business. Doc Abernathy pressed his stethoscope to Tommy's chest. At least that's what they'll argue in court. And since Wallace controls the court, good luck proving otherwise. How do you know all this? Because I'm the one who stitched up the surveyor after Wallace's men beat him half to death and told him to leave town. Doc Abernathy straightened up. The boy's lungs sound better. Keep him warm and dry. That medicine from Denver, it costs $40. I can order it, but... Order it, Joshua said. I'll pay. Joshua, you can't. Sarah started. I can and I will. Order the medicine, Doc. Abernathy nodded slowly. All right. It'll take 2 weeks to arrive. Maybe 3 if the weather's bad. He closed his medical bag. You should know something else. Wallace isn't working alone. There's a railroad man in town, Marcus Brennan. He's the one pulling the strings. Wallace is just the local fixer. Where can I find Brennan? The hotel. But I'd be careful, Miller. Brennan travels with protection. Professional protection, if you understand my meaning. Joshua understood. He'd dealt with hired guns before. There's one more thing, Doc Abernathy said, moving toward the door. 3 other families on that railroad route. The Johnsons, the Krugers, and the Mendozas. All facing the same situation as Mrs. Bennett, sudden debts, foreclosure notices, pressure to leave. If you're thinking about fighting this, you won't be fighting alone. After the doctor left, silence filled the cabin. Tommy had fallen back asleep. Emma sat by the fire, pretending not to listen, but hearing everything. We should talk to them, Sarah said. The other families. If we stand together, they'll crush you together just as easily as separate. Joshua set the journal on the table. We need evidence, real evidence, something that proves Wallace and Brennan are working together illegally. Thomas's journal is a good start, but it's not enough. It's notes from a dead man with no witnesses. We need documents, contracts, letters, something that ties them together in writing. And how do we get that? Joshua looked out the window at the snow-covered mountains. I'm working on it. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm. Joshua rode into town each morning, leaving before Sarah woke, returning after dark. He didn't say where he went or what he did, and Sarah didn't ask. She spent the days making the cabin livable, cleaning, organizing, cooking real meals with the supplies Joshua had. Tommy grew stronger. Emma started to smile again. On the 4th morning, Joshua came back different. Sarah knew the moment he walked through the door. His face was harder, his eyes distant. He moved like a man preparing for violence. What happened? She asked. Joshua poured coffee, drank it standing. I've been watching the hotel. Brennan and Wallace meet every night. Last night I followed Brennan after. He went to a house on the edge of town. Turns out it's owned by Sheriff Thompson. The sheriff's in on it? Looks that way. Joshua set his cup down. But that's not the interesting part. After Brennan left Thompson's house, he went somewhere else. An old warehouse by the rail yard. He was there for maybe 10 minutes. When he came out, he was carrying a satchel he didn't have going in. Documents. Maybe just money. But whatever's in that warehouse, Brennan thought it was worth visiting at midnight in the freezing cold. Sarah understood where this was going. You want to break in. I want to look around. That's called breaking in, Joshua. Only if I get caught. Joshua finally sat down, and Sarah saw how tired he was. 3 days of surveillance had worn him down. Sarah, if there's evidence in that warehouse, contracts, ledgers, anything that proves they're working together, we might have a chance. Without it, Wallace will take your land and every other property on that route, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. And if you get caught, then I go to jail and you're on your own. Sarah looked at her children. Tommy sleeping peacefully. Emma reading a book Joshua had given her. For the first time in months, they looked safe. Fed. Warm. Happy. When? She asked. Tonight. Moon's dark, and there's another storm coming in. Good cover. I'm coming with you. No. Joshua. No. His voice was firm. Someone needs to stay with the children. And if something goes wrong, someone needs to know where I went and why. That's you. Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Promise me you'll be careful. I'm always careful. You're always reckless. There's a difference. Joshua almost smiled. Fair point. That night, after the children were asleep, Joshua prepared. He changed into dark clothes, checked his rifle, his pistol, filled a small pack with tools. He might need a pry bar, a lantern, matches. Sarah watched him work with growing dread. "You know this is insane." "I've done worse." "That's not reassuring." Joshua straightened up, met her eyes. "If I'm not back by dawn, you take the children and ride to Doc Abernathy's house. He'll help you get to Helena. There's a federal marshal there, John Hammond. Good man. Tell him everything. Give him Thomas's journal. He'll know what to do." "Joshua, promise me, Sarah." She nodded, throat tight. "I promise." Joshua moved to the door, then stopped. "That night at Gettysburg, when I was burning up with fever and out of my head, you sang to me. Do you remember? I sang to all the soldiers. It helped calm them. You sang Amazing Grace. I remember thinking, if there was grace in the world, it sounded like your voice." Joshua pulled his coat on. "Thought you should know that." He was gone before she could respond, vanishing into the darkness and the beginning snow. Sarah sat by the fire waiting. Tommy stirred in his sleep. Emma muttered something unintelligible. The cabin creaked in the wind. She picked up Thomas's journal, read through it again. Her husband's handwriting careful and precise. Notes about men who'd threatened him. About offers that were really demands. About a system that crushed anyone who stood in its way. But Thomas had stood anyway. Had documented everything. Had tried to fight back, and it had killed him. Sarah closed the journal and stared into the fire. Joshua was out there now, risking his life for people he barely knew. For a promise made 22 years ago to a nurse he'd met once. Or maybe for something else. Maybe for the wife and son he couldn't save. Maybe for a chance at redemption he didn't think he deserved. The hours crawled past. Midnight. 1 in the morning. 2. At 3, she heard footsteps on the porch. Sarah grabbed Joshua's spare rifle, moved to the door. "Who's there?" "It's me." She threw the door open. Joshua stumbled inside, and Sarah's heart stopped. Blood ran down his face from a gash above his eye. His coat was torn. He carried a leather satchel clutched against his chest like it was made of gold. "Oh my God." "I'm fine." Joshua set the satchel on the table, swayed slightly. "Got what we need." "You're bleeding." "Just a cut. I've had worse." But he let her guide him to a chair, let her fetch water and cloth to clean the wound. "What happened?" Sarah asked, dabbing at the blood. "Warehouse wasn't empty. Brennan had a man watching it. We had a disagreement about whether I should be there." "Where's the man now?" "Sleeping. He'll wake up with a headache, but he'll live." Joshua winced as Sarah pressed the cloth against his cut. "I found this in a back office. Took everything that looked important." Sarah opened the satchel. Inside were ledgers, contracts, maps. She pulled out a contract and began reading. Her eyes went wide. This is the agreement between Wallace and the railroad. It lists all 15 properties. The amounts Wallace is paying versus the amounts he's selling for." She flipped pages. "Joshua, the difference is over $50,000. He's stealing $50,000 from these families." "Keep reading." Sarah found another document, a letter from Brennan to Wallace. She read it twice to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. "They planned the mine collapse," she whispered. "They hired someone to—" Her voice broke. "Thomas. They killed Thomas. They killed him because he was asking questions." Joshua's hand found hers. "We'll make them pay for it. I promise you that." Sarah wiped her eyes, forced herself to keep reading. There were more documents, payoffs to Sheriff Thompson, threats sent to families who refused to sell even a contract with hired enforcers to handle problems. "This is everything," she said. "This proves all of it." "That's what I figured." Joshua stood up, testing his balance. The cut had stopped bleeding. "Come morning we ride to Helena. Federal Marshal needs to see this." "That's 2 days' ride, maybe 3 with the children." "I know. We leave at first light. Pack what you need." Sarah looked at her children still sleeping peacefully. "They'll come after us. Wallace and Brennan. They'll know you took this. They'll try." "Joshua, I won't let them hurt you. Any of you." Joshua's voice was iron. "I failed people before. I won't fail you. I can't." Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded and began packing. They left as the sun rose, 4 people on 3 horses, Joshua on his gelding with Tommy in front of him. Sarah and Emma together on one of the horses Joshua kept for emergencies. The satchel was strapped to Joshua's saddle, never more than arm's reach away. The first day went smooth. They stayed off main trails, moved through back country Joshua knew by heart. Made camp that night in a cave he'd used before, out of the wind. Tommy's breathing stayed steady. Emma told stories to keep her brother distracted. The second day, Joshua started watching their back trail more carefully. "What is it?" Sarah asked during a rest stop. "Probably nothing." But his hand stayed near his rifle. An hour later, they heard horses behind them. Joshua didn't hesitate. "Into the trees. Now!" They pushed their horses into a thick stand of pines, dismounted, kept the animals quiet. Joshua moved to the edge of the trees, rifle ready. 5 riders came into view. James Wallace led them, and Sarah recognized 2 of the others, the men who'd been at her cabin that first day. The other 2 looked harder, meaner. Professional trouble. "Fan out," James ordered. "They came through here. Find their tracks." The riders spread out searching. One came within 20 feet of their hiding spot. Joshua's finger found his trigger, but the man turned away, kept searching. After 15 minutes, that felt like 15 hours, James called them back. "They're not here. Keep moving north. They're heading for Helena. We'll cut them off at Devil's Pass." The riders moved on, and Joshua waited another 10 minutes before relaxing. "They know where we're going," Sarah said. "They're guessing, but it's a good guess." Joshua helped her and Emma remount. Devil's Pass is the fastest route to Helena, but there are others. Slower routes. Much slower. Add another 2 days, maybe 3. Sarah looked at Tommy, already exhausted from 2 days of riding. "Can he make it?" "He'll have to." Joshua swung into his saddle. "Because if we go through Devil's Pass, we ride straight into an ambush. And I'm not that lucky or that good." They changed direction, heading east into rougher country. The terrain got steeper, the trails less defined. Snow was deeper here, slowing them down. They made maybe 10 miles before dark forced them to stop. That night camped in another cave with a small fire. Emma asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "Are we going to die?" Joshua looked up from sharpening his knife. "No. But those men are behind us, and they don't know where we are. We've got supplies, and we've got these mountains. That's enough. What if they find us?" "Then I'll handle it." Joshua's voice was gentle but firm. "Emma, I know you're scared, but I promise you I will not let them hurt you or your brother or your mother. You understand, I promise." Emma nodded, but Sarah could see the doubt in her daughter's eyes. The girl had seen too much broken promise in her short life to trust easy. That night Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay next to her children, listening to Joshua keep watch by the cave entrance. Around midnight, she gave up and joined him. "You should rest," he said, without looking at her. "Can't." Sarah sat down beside him. "Joshua, what if we don't make it? What if we'll make it? You can't know that." "Yes, I can." Joshua turned to face her. "Sarah, I've been dead inside for 3 years, going through motions waiting for nothing. Then I heard that gunshot and something woke up. Something I thought was gone forever." "What?" "Purpose, reason, something worth fighting for." His hand found hers in the darkness. "I will get you to Helena. I will get that evidence to the Marshal, and I will see Wallace and Brennan pay for what they did. That's not hope. That's not faith. That's just fact." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. "I'm glad it was you. That day at my cabin. I'm glad it was you who came." Joshua squeezed her hand once, then stood up. "Get some sleep. We've got hard riding tomorrow." The third day brought them to the Snake River Canyon. Joshua led them along a narrow trail that hugged the canyon wall 200 feet above churning water. The horses picked their way carefully, and Sarah tried not to look down. They were halfway across when they herded horses ahead blocking the trail. Joshua pulled up short. 3 riders waited where the trail narrowed to single file. No way around. No way back without being exposed on the open trail. Sarah recognized one of them immediately. Marcus Brennan himself, flanked by 2 hired guns. "Mr. Miller?" Brennan called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Nothing here belongs to you," Joshua called back. "The satchel, the documents you stole. Hand them over and you can all ride away. Otherwise—" Brennan shrugged. "This is a dangerous trail. Accidents happen." Joshua's mind raced. 3 men ahead. James Wallace and 2 more probably behind them by now, trapped on a trail barely wide enough for 1 horse. He looked at Sarah, at the children. Tommy was pale with fear, Emma trying to be brave. Then Joshua did something Sarah didn't expect. He smiled. "All right, Brennan, you win." Joshua reached for the satchel. "But you come get it yourself. I don't trust your men not to shoot the moment I hand it over." Brennan considered this. Then he nodded and urged his horse forward, leaving his men behind. He was 10 feet away when Joshua threw the satchel, not to Brennan, but over the edge of the cliff. "No!" Brennan screamed, watching it fall toward the river. In that moment of distraction, Joshua drew his pistol and fired not at Brennan, but at the ground between the man's horse's front legs. The horse reared, panicked, and Brennan fought for control on the narrow trail. "Ride!" Joshua shouted to Sarah. "Now!" She didn't question, just kicked her horse forward. Emma screamed, but held on. Joshua snatched Tommy, wheeled his own horse, and charged back the way they'd come. Behind them, gunfire erupted. Bullets whined off rocks. Joshua hunched over Tommy, making himself a shield, and pushed his horse harder. They burst around a bend and found exactly what Joshua expected: James Wallace and 2 men blocking the trail. But Joshua had been counting on that. He'd spotted something earlier, a side trail so narrow he'd almost missed it. Without slowing, he turned his horse onto it, Sarah following on instinct. The trail dropped steeply, winding down the canyon wall. Too steep, too fast. Joshua's horse slipped, caught itself, kept going. Behind them, Sarah's horse stumbled. Emma screamed again. Then they were at the bottom on the canyon floor, the river roaring beside them. Joshua didn't stop. He followed the river east away from the trails into country only someone who knew these mountains could navigate. They rode for 2 more hours before Joshua finally slowed, found a place to hide. The horses got everyone under cover. Tommy was crying. Emma was shaking. Sarah looked like she might break. "The satchel," Sarah said. "You threw away the evidence." "I threw away a satchel full of blank paper and rocks." Joshua pulled the real satchel from inside his coat. "The real one's been under my shirt since we left. Figured they'd try something like this eventually." Sarah stared at him. Then she laughed, high and slightly hysterical, but real. "You magnificent bastard." Joshua allowed himself a small smile. Then he checked Tommy, who'd stopped crying and was just clinging to his mother now. Checked Emma, who was bruised but unbroken. "We can't make Helena now," Sarah said. "They'll have every trail watched." "Don't need to go to Helena." Joshua pointed east. "Fort Benton's 3 days that way. Federal Marshal stationed there too. We can make it if we keep moving." 3 more days. 3 more days. Sarah looked at her exhausted children, at the man who'd risked everything to save them. She straightened her shoulders and nodded. "Then let's move." They rode through the night, through the next day, through another night. Stopped only when the horses absolutely had to rest. Ate cold food. Slept in shifts. On the morning of the 3rd day, Fort Benton appeared on the horizon like a promise kept. Joshua had never been so relieved to see civilization. They rode through the gates, and Joshua asked for the Federal Marshal. found him in his office, a lean man named Harrison, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Joshua set the satchel on Harrison's desk. "Marshal, my name's Joshua Miller, former marshal out of Helena. I've got evidence of fraud, murder, and conspiracy involving a circuit judge and the Northern Pacific Railroad. And I've got 5 hired guns probably a day behind me who'll kill to get this back." Harrison opened the satchel, started reading. His face went hard. This is big," he said finally. "Judge Wallace, are you certain? Read the documents. It's all there." Harrison kept reading, and with each page his expression grew darker. Finally he looked up at Sarah. "Mrs. Bennett, these notes, your husband wrote these?" "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry no one helped him when he asked for it." Harrison stood up. "I'm placing Judge Thaddeus Wallace and Marcus Brennan under arrest, and I'm issuing warrants for James Wallace and anyone else named in these documents." "They're coming," Joshua warned. "Could be here today. Let them come. This is a federal fort. They try anything here, they'll face a lot more than legal trouble." Harrison called for his deputies. "Get these people food, water, and a place to rest. And someone send a telegraph to Helena. I want backup here by tomorrow." As the deputies led them away, Sarah caught Joshua's arm. "We did it. We actually did it." Joshua nodded suddenly, so tired he could barely stand. "Yeah, we did." That night, in a real bed in the fort's guest quarters, Sarah let herself cry. For Thomas. For the last 4 terrible months. For the fear that was finally over. Tommy slept peacefully, his breathing easier than it had been in weeks. Emma curled beside her mother, safe at last. And in the next room, Joshua Miller slept without dreams for the second time in 3 years. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, 5 men rode toward Fort Benton with vengeance in their hearts. But inside the fort walls, 4 people who'd survived hell together finally rested. Tomorrow would bring new fights. Tomorrow would bring trials and testimony and justice. But tonight, they were safe. And sometimes that was enough. The attack came at dawn. Joshua was already awake, standing at the window of the guest quarters, watching the sky turn from black to gray. He'd learned long ago that men who meant violence preferred the uncertain light of early morning, late enough to see early enough that most people were still sleeping. He saw them coming before the sentries did. 5 riders approaching the fort gates at a pace just slow enough to avoid immediate alarm, but fast enough to reach the walls before anyone could properly react. "Sarah," he said quietly, not turning from the window. "Get the children. Get them to Marshal Harrison's office. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Harrison." She was up instantly, no questions moving, with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that hesitation could kill. Emma woke silently, already reaching for Tommy. They'd all learned to move fast these past days. Joshua grabbed his rifle and was out the door before Sarah had Tommy fully dressed. He took the stairs 3 at a time, burst into the courtyard just as the riders reached the gates. "Close those gates," he shouted to the sentries. "Now." But it was too late. The riders were already inside, and Joshua recognized James Wallace in the lead. The man's face was twisted with rage and something worse, desperation. A desperate man was more dangerous than an angry one. "Where's Miller?" James's voice carried across the courtyard. "Where's that bastard Miller?" "Right here." Joshua stepped into view, rifle held loose but ready. "You're inside a federal fort, Wallace. You and your men need to leave, now." "Not without those documents." James dismounted, his hand hovering near his pistol. "You stole property that belongs to my family." "I stole evidence of your crimes. There's a difference." Marshal Harrison emerged from his office, 3 deputies flanking him. "Mr. Wallace, you're under arrest. Conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. Your father, too. Warrants were issued an hour ago." James laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Warrants from who?" "Every judge in Montana Territory answers to my father. You think some federal marshal can touch us?" "I'm not asking." Harrison nodded to his deputies. "Take him." That's when everything went to hell. One of James's men drew and fired in the same motion. The bullet caught a deputy in the shoulder, spun him around. Joshua's rifle came up automatically, training taking over. He fired once, twice. Two of James's hired guns went down. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Soldiers poured from the barracks. More gunfire. Someone screaming. Joshua lost sight of James in the confusion, pressed himself against a wall, tried to get a clear shot at anything that mattered. Then he saw Sarah. She was in the doorway of Harrison's office, frozen with fear, Tommy in her arms. Emma stood beside her, eyes wide with terror. They were completely exposed, and one of James's men had seen them. The gunman raised his pistol, aimed at Sarah, and Joshua didn't think. He just moved. He crossed 15 feet in maybe 2 seconds, slammed into Sarah, and the children drove them back through the doorway just as the bullet hit the doorframe where Sarah's head had been. Wood exploded into splinters. "Stay down." Joshua threw himself back out into the courtyard, brought his rifle up, found the gunman who'd shot at Sarah, fired. The man dropped, but James was gone, vanished in the chaos like smoke. The gunfight lasted maybe 3 minutes total, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, 3 of James's men were dead or dying. The 4th had surrendered, but James himself had disappeared. "Spread out," Harrison ordered his men. "Find him. Lock down the fort." Joshua moved back to the office where Sarah huddled with the children. She was shaking, holding Tommy so tight the boy could barely breathe. "Are you hurt?" Joshua knelt beside them, checking for wounds even as he asked. No, we're..." Sarah's voice broke. "He tried to kill us. He looked right at me and tried to kill us." "I know." Joshua's hands were steady as he checked Emma, then Tommy. "No injuries. Just fear." "But he failed. You're safe." "Are we?" Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Are we really safe, Joshua? Or is this just going to keep happening?" Joshua had no good answer for that. So he just pulled her close, let her cry against his shoulder, while Emma held Tommy and Harrison's men, searched the fort for a man who'd already escaped. They found James's horse an hour later, hidden behind the stables. He'd fled on foot into the surrounding wilderness. Smart move, harder to track, easier to disappear. "We'll find him," Harrison said, but Joshua could hear the doubt in his voice. Montana territory was vast. A man who knew the country could disappear for months. "What about Judge Wallace?" Joshua asked. "And Brennan? Already sent men to arrest them both. They should be in custody by noon." Harrison rubbed his face, suddenly looking exhausted. "This is going to be the biggest trial Montana's seen in 20 years. Federal prosecutors are already on their way from Washington. They want to make an example." "Good." Sarah had composed herself, though her eyes were still red. "They should pay for what they did. All of them." But paying for crimes meant a trial, and a trial meant testimony, and testimony meant staying in Montana territory until it was over. Could be months. Could be longer. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Sarah found Joshua on the roof of the barracks. He'd taken to keeping watch from up there, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fort walls. "You can't stay up here forever," she said, climbing up to sit beside him. "Can until James is caught. Harrison says that could take weeks." "Then I'll be up here weeks." Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same darkness he watched. "Back at Gettysburg, after you were well enough to leave the hospital, you told me something. Do you remember?" "I told you a lot of things. I was half crazy with fever. You said the war had taught you that the only thing that mattered was being there when people needed you. That everything else, rank, reputation, even victory, was just noise." Sarah turned to look at him. "You said the only sin that mattered was absence." Joshua remembered. He'd been 23 years old and still believed the world made sense. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Being there isn't enough. I was there when my wife got sick, watched her die over 3 days, watched my son die in her arms. Being there just meant I got to see it happen, meant I got to fail in person. You didn't fail them, Joshua. I couldn't save them. Some things can't be saved. Some things just happen, and all we can do is bear witness. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness. But you saved us. Tommy would be dead by now if you hadn't come. Emma too, probably. And me. We'd all be dead or broken or worse. You were there, and it mattered. Joshua wanted to argue, wanted to explain that saving them didn't erase failing his family. But her hand was warm in his, and the words stuck in his throat. The trial starts in 2 weeks, Sarah said. Harrison says we'll have to testify, all of us. I know. They'll try to destroy us on the stand, make us look like liars or opportunists or worse. I know that too. And James is still out there somewhere waiting for his chance. Sarah, what's your point? She turned to face him fully. My point is that I'm scared, terrified actually, but I'm also angry. Angry at what they did to Thomas, to those other families, to us. And I want them to pay. I want to stand up in that courtroom and tell everyone what they did. I want justice. Justice doesn't always win. But it should. And someone has to fight for it. Even when it's hard. Even when it's dangerous. She squeezed his hand. Thomas tried to fight alone, and they killed him for it. But we're not alone. We have each other. We have the truth. We have you. Joshua looked at her. This woman who'd buried her husband, nearly lost her children, survived hell, and still had the courage to demand justice instead of just survival. Something in his chest tightened. All right, he said. We fight, all the way to the end. Sarah smiled, and for the first time in days, it reached her eyes. Thank you. They sat together in the darkness, keeping watch until the sky began to lighten with dawn. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of limbo. Federal prosecutors arrived with boxes of documents and endless questions. Sarah and Joshua spent hours going over their testimony, preparing for every possible attack the defense might make. Emma was questioned too, though more gently. Even Tommy had to give a statement about what he'd seen and heard. Doc Abernathy arrived with other witnesses, the 3 families from the railroad route, the surveyor who'd been beaten miners who'd worked with Thomas Bennett. Each had their own story of threats, intimidation, and stolen land. Judge Wallace was brought in under guard, his face a mask of controlled rage. Marcus Brennan came 2 days later, already lawyered up with 3 attorneys from back east. Both men maintained their innocence, claimed everything was legitimate business. James Wallace remained at large. On the morning the trial began, Joshua woke to find Sarah already dressed, standing at the window of their room in the fort's guest quarters. She wore the only good dress she owned, plain blue calico, but clean and pressed. You don't have to do this, Joshua said. I can testify. The others can testify. You could stay here with the children. Yes, I do have to do this. Sarah didn't turn from the window. Thomas died because he tried to expose these men. If I don't testify, if I don't tell the truth about what they did, then he died for nothing. Sarah. I'm going, Joshua. You can come with me or not, but I'm going. So they went. The trial was held in Fort Benton's largest building, converted into a makeshift courtroom. Federal Judge Montgomery presided, a stern man from Philadelphia, with no connections to Montana Territory, and therefore no reason to fear the Wallace name. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. Documents proving the conspiracy between Wallace and Brennan. Testimony from the surveyor about being beaten. Statements from families who'd been threatened. Thomas Bennett's journal read aloud in court, each entry another nail in the coffin. Then it was Sarah's turn to testify. Joshua watched her take the stand, watched her place her hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth. She looked small up there, fragile. But when she began speaking, her voice was steady. She told them about Thomas's death, about the sudden deaths and the men who came threatening, about feeding her children scraps because she had nothing else, about the day James Wallace kicked her and Joshua Miller appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't had the strength to make. The defense attorney, a slick Easterner named Carlyle, tried to shake her. Mrs. Bennet, isn't it true that your husband was a heavy drinker? No. Isn't it true he gambled? No. Then how do you explain the debts? They were invented, created to justify stealing our land. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Sarah's voice didn't waver. My husband kept meticulous records. He was careful with money. Those debts didn't exist until after he started asking questions about the railroad route. Carlyle tried another angle. Mrs. Bennet, you're currently living with Mr. Joshua Miller. Are you not? I'm staying in his cabin with my children. He offered us shelter when we had nowhere else to go. How convenient. A widow with 2 children, a handsome stranger. Objection. The prosecutor was on his feet. Counsel is implying. I'm implying nothing, Carlyle said smoothly. I'm simply establishing that Mrs. Bennet has a personal interest in supporting Mr. Miller's version of events. Judge Montgomery frowned. Make your point, Mr. Carlyle. My point, Your Honor, is that Mrs. Bennet's testimony may be colored by gratitude or even affection for the man who rescued her. She has every reason to support his narrative regardless of its truth. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. Are you suggesting I'm lying? I'm suggesting your perspective may be compromised. My perspective, Sarah said, her voice rising, is that these men killed my husband, tried to steal my land, and would have let my children freeze to death rather than admit what they'd done. My perspective is that you're sitting there in your expensive suit defending murderers and thieves because they pay you well enough not to care about the truth. So yes, Mr. Carlyle, my perspective is compromised. By facts, by evidence, by the truth. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Montgomery banged his gavel. That's enough. Mrs. Bennet, you're dismissed. Mr. Carlyle, watch your tone with this witness. Sarah stepped down her legs, shaking so badly she could barely walk. Joshua met her at the gate, offered his arm. She took it gratefully. You did good, he whispered. I wanted to hit him. I know, so did I. Over the next 3 days, more witnesses testified. The prosecution built its case brick by brick until the evidence was overwhelming. Even Carlyle's skilled cross-examination couldn't shake the fundamental truth Judge Wallace and Marcus Brennan had conspired to steal land through fraud and intimidation, and Thomas Bennet had died because he'd tried to stop them. On the 4th day, Joshua took the stand. He kept his testimony simple, factual. What he'd seen, what he'd heard, what he'd found in the warehouse. He didn't embellish, didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. Carlyle tried to attack his credibility. Mr. Miller, you were a marshal once. Why did you resign? Personal reasons. Can you be more specific? No. Isn't it true you resigned under suspicion of dereliction of duty? Joshua's jaw tightened. I resigned because my family died while I was working. I couldn't do the job anymore. Nothing was ever proven because there was nothing to prove. Yet you abandoned your post. I resigned properly through the appropriate channels. My resignation was accepted. There was no investigation, no charges. You're implying something that doesn't exist. Carlyle changed tactics. Mr. Miller, you've developed quite a close relationship with Mrs. Bennet, haven't you? I offered her and her children shelter. That's all. That's all. You've been living together for nearly a month now. In separate rooms with her children present. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that your testimony might be motivated by factors other than truth. Affection, perhaps, or a desire to play the hero. My testimony. Joshua cut him off, his voice cold as winter steel, is motivated by the fact that I watched these men try to murder a woman and her children over $200 and a worthless piece of land. I'm motivated by evidence that proves they killed her husband for asking questions. I'm motivated by the truth, Mr. Carlyle. Something you might want to try sometime. Judge Montgomery banged his gavel. Mr. Miller, confine yourself to answering the questions. Yes, Your Honor. But the damage was done. The jury had seen Joshua's anger, his passion, and they'd seen that it came from conviction, not calculation. On the fifth day, Emma Bennett testified. She was so small in the witness chair, her feet barely touching the floor. But when the prosecutor asked her what she remembered, she spoke clearly. They came to our cabin, Mr. James Wallace and his men. They said we owed money. Mama said we didn't have any money. Mr. Wallace kicked her. She fell down. I thought he was going to hurt her more. Emma's voice wavered, but didn't break. Then Mr. Miller came. He had a rifle. He told them to leave. They left. Carlyle didn't cross-examine. Even he wasn't willing to attack a 12-year-old girl in open court. The defense's case was weak. They called character witnesses for Judge Wallace, local businessmen, attorneys, politicians. All testified to his integrity, his service to the community. But none could explain away the documents, the ledgers, the evidence of conspiracy. Brennan didn't testify. His lawyers advised against it. Judge Wallace did testify, claiming everything was legitimate business. The debts were real, the land acquisitions legal. He denied knowing about any violence or intimidation. I'm a circuit judge, he said from the stand, his voice full of wounded dignity. I've served Montana Territory for 20 years. The idea that I would engage in fraud or conspiracy is preposterous. But the prosecutor destroyed him on cross-examination, going through the documents line by line, showing payments from Brennan, showing the discrepancy between what he paid families and what he charged the railroad, showing letters that proved he knew exactly what was happening. By the end of his testimony, Judge Wallace looked like what he was, a corrupt official caught red-handed. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Judge Thaddeus Wallace and Marcus Brennan were convicted of conspiracy fraud and accessory to murder. They would face federal prison probably for the rest of their lives. When the verdict was read, Sarah broke down crying. Joshua held her while she sobbed. And for the first time since Thomas died, she let herself feel the full weight of her grief and rage and relief. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. The other families from the railroad route, townspeople who'd watched the Wallace family abuse their power for years, reporters from Denver and San Francisco who'd come to cover the trial. Doc Abernathy pushed through the crowd to shake Joshua's hand. You did it, Miller. You actually did it. We did it, Joshua corrected. All of us. Marshal Harrison appeared with news. The railroad's withdrawing from the route. Too much bad publicity. They're going to build further south instead. And the territorial governor has invalidated all of Wallace's land seizures. The families can go home. The properties are theirs again. Sarah looked up at Joshua, tears still streaming. We can go home. But before anyone could respond, a shot rang out. Joshua felt the bullet before he heard it, a white-hot burn across his ribs. He staggered, caught himself against a post. Around him, people screamed and scattered. Shoot her! Someone yelled. On the roof. Marshal Harrison was already moving, drawing his pistol, shouting orders. Joshua looked up and saw James Wallace silhouetted against the sky, rifle in hand, chambering another round. Time seemed to slow. Joshua saw James aim again, not at him this time, but at Sarah. Saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. Saw certain death a split second away. Joshua moved without thinking. He threw himself in front of Sarah, drove her to the ground as the second shot rang out. Felt the impact in his left shoulder, felt his arm go numb. Then Harrison's men were firing back, and James Wallace fell from the roof like a puppet with cut strings. Joshua lay on the ground, blood spreading across his shirt. Sarah screaming his name. The world was spinning, going gray at the edges. He tried to tell her he was fine, tried to say it was just a scratch, but the words wouldn't come. Doc Abernathy's face appeared above him. Someone get me inside. I need a clean room and my bag. Move. They carried Joshua into the nearest building, the general store, and cleared a table. Doc Abernathy cut away his shirt, assessed the damage. Through and through on the ribs, just a graze. The shoulders worse, bullets still in there. I need to operate. Sarah, I need you to hold him down. I'm fine, Joshua managed to say. You're not fine. You've been shot twice. Be quiet and let me work. The next hour was pain and chaos. Doc dug the bullet out while Joshua bit down on leather and tried not to scream. Sarah held his hand so tight he thought his fingers might break. Emma stood in the corner, white-faced and silent. Tommy had been taken outside, spared from seeing this. Finally, Doc straightened up. Got it. He'll live, but he needs rest. No riding, no fighting, no heroics for at least a month. Understand, Miller? Joshua nodded weakly. I mean it. You tear these stitches, you'll bleed out before anyone can help you. I understand. Doc Abernathy cleaned up, packed his bag. James Wallace is dead. Broke his neck in the fall. It's over, Joshua. It's finally over. But Joshua barely heard him. He was looking at Sarah, at the tears streaming down her face, at the way she held his hand like letting go might kill him. You jumped in front of me, she said. You could have died. Couldn't let him shoot you. You idiot, you absolute idiot. She was crying and laughing at the same time. You could have died. But I didn't. Joshua managed a weak smile. Told you I wouldn't fail you. Sarah leaned down and kissed his forehead. You never did. Not once. They kept Joshua in Fort Benton for 3 weeks while he healed. Sarah stayed with him, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, changing his bandages, forcing him to eat, even when he wasn't hungry. Emma read to him books she found in the fort's small library. Tommy drew pictures of horses and mountains, and gave them to Joshua like treasures. Slowly the pain faded. The wounds began to heal. Joshua's strength returned. On a clear morning in late spring, Doc Abernathy finally pronounced him fit to travel. You'll have scars, Doc said, examining the shoulder wound one last time. And that shoulder might ache when it rains. But you'll live. Good enough. They packed what little they had. The territorial governor had sent a letter with official apologies and a payment compensation for what they'd endured. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start over. Marshal Harrison saw them off at the gates. You ever want your badge back, Miller, you let me know. Montana could use more lawmen like you. I'm done with that life, Joshua said. Time for something different. They rode out of Fort Benton on a morning bright with promise. 4 people who'd survived hell together heading home to a ranch in the mountains. Sarah and Emma on one horse, Joshua and Tommy on another. The mountains rose ahead of them, snow-capped and eternal. What happens now? Emma asked as they rode. Joshua looked at Sarah, saw her smile, and felt something in his chest finally unknot something that had been tight for 3 years. Now we build something new, he said. Now we live. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Joshua Miller believed it. The ranch looked different when they returned. Spring had come to the mountains while they'd been gone, melting the snow and turning everything green. Joshua's cabin stood solid against the tree-lined smoke rising from the chimney. Someone had kept the fire going in their absence. They found out who when Doc Abernathy emerged from the door, wiping his hands on a towel. Figured you'd be back eventually, Doc said, grinning. Been keeping the place warm. Hope you don't mind. Mind? Joshua dismounted carefully, his shoulders still tender. I'm grateful. Well, you've got more to be grateful for. Come see. Doc led them around back, and Joshua stopped in his tracks. His small ranch had transformed. New fences marked out pastures. A chicken coop stood where there'd been nothing before. Someone had repaired the barn roof and added a lean-to for storage. 3 horses grazed in the field, not Joshua's horses, but healthy animals that looked ready for work. What is all this? Sarah asked Tommy, still in her arms. The other families from the railroad route, Doc explained. The Johnsons, the Krugers, the Mendozas. Once they got their land back, they wanted to do something for you, for both of you. So they've been coming by in shifts fixing things up. Building. Preparing. Preparing for what? Joshua's voice was rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. For what comes next? Doc pulled a folded paper from his pocket. This came from the territorial governor, official grant. He's opening up the land that was supposed to go to the railroad, all 15 properties, plus the connecting parcels. Any family willing to work it can claim 160 acres, free and clear. Sarah's hand found Joshua's. That's homestead land. More than that. It's a chance to build something real, a community. Town maybe if enough people come. Doc looked at them both. Governor wants you two to oversee it. Says Montana needs more people who'll fight for what's right instead of just what's profitable. Joshua looked at Sarah, saw hope and fear warring in her eyes. That's a big ask. It is, Doc agreed. But you'd be good at it. Both of you. You've already proven you can stand up to power. Imagine what you could do with it. That night, after the children were asleep, and Doc had ridden back to town, Joshua and Sarah sat on the porch, passing a cup of coffee between them. What do you think? Sarah asked finally. About the governor's offer. About all of it. Building a community. More people coming. Everything changing. Joshua was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds, owls in the pines, wind in the grass, the creek running somewhere below the cabin. 3 years ago, he said finally, I came here to die. Not physically maybe, but in every way that mattered. I wanted silence and isolation, and nothing that could hurt me again. He turned to look at her. Then you came, and Tommy and Emma, and suddenly I had reasons to be alive again, reasons to fight. Is that a yes? It's a yes to whatever you want, Sarah. You want to build a community here, we'll build it. You want to move to Helena and start fresh somewhere no one knows us, we'll do that. You want to take the children and go back east away from all this. I want to stay. Sarah's voice was firm. I want to stay here with you and build something good. Something Thomas would have wanted. Something our children can grow up in without fear. Joshua nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. Just like that. Just like that. Sarah smiled, but it faded quickly. Joshua, there's something I need to ask you. Something I've been afraid to ask. Ask it. What are we? You and me. Because we're living together, raising children together, building a future together. But I don't know what to call us. I don't know what this is. Joshua set the coffee cup down and took both her hands in his. Sarah, I loved my wife. Loved her with everything I had. When she died, I thought that part of me died too. Thought I'd never feel that way again, never want to. I understand. Let me finish. His grip tightened gently. Then I met you. Or re-met you, I guess. And at first it was just about doing the right thing, helping someone who needed help. But somewhere along the way, maybe in that blizzard, maybe during the trial, maybe just sitting here on this porch, something changed. I started feeling things I thought were gone forever. What kind of things? Hope, purpose, the idea that maybe I deserved a second chance. Joshua pulled her closer. Sarah, I'm not good with words. Never have been. But if you're asking what we are, what I want us to be, then, yes. Sarah interrupted, tears streaming down her face. Whatever you're about to say, yes. Joshua laughed, the sound rusty but real. You don't even know what I was going to say. Doesn't matter. The answer's still yes. He kissed her, then gentle and careful like she might break. She kissed him back, like she was claiming something she'd almost lost. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. We should probably tell the children, Sarah said, wiping her eyes. They already know. Emma asked me last week if I was going to marry you. What did you tell her? I told her I was waiting for her mother to ask me. Sarah laughed, punched his good shoulder lightly. That's not how it works. Isn't it? You're the one who kept asking what we were. All right, fine. Sarah stood up, pulled him to his feet. "Joshua Miller, will you marry me and help me raise these children and build this community and probably drive me crazy for the next 40 years?" Sarah Bennett, "I will." They married 3 weeks later in a ceremony Doc Abernathy officiated, since the nearest preacher was 2 days' ride away. Emma cried happy tears. Tommy asked if this meant Joshua was his new papa. Joshua said yes, his voice breaking on the word. The other families came: the Johnsons with their 3 boys, the Krugers with their twin daughters, the Mendozas with their grandmother, who barely spoke English but smiled at everyone. They brought food and gifts and promises to help build. Sheriff Thompson came too, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "I know I don't deserve to be here," he said to Joshua. "I should have helped Mrs. Bennett when she first came to me. Should have investigated Wallace instead of looking the other way. But I want you to know I'm trying to do better. Be better." Joshua studied the man for a long moment. "You testify at the trial. That took courage." "Took me too long to find it." "Maybe, but you found it eventually. That counts for something." Joshua held out his hand. "We're building something new here. Could use a lawman who's learned from his mistakes." Thompson shook his hand, relief clear on his face. "I'll do right by you, I swear it." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. More families arrived, drawn by the promise of free land and a fresh start. Some were miners who'd lost their claims. Others were farmers fleeing drought in Kansas. A few were simply drifters looking for a place to belong. Joshua and Sarah became the unofficial leaders, settling disputes, organizing work parties, making decisions about where to build what. It wasn't a role Joshua had wanted, but it was one he'd grown into without realizing. One morning, a wagon appeared on the road carrying a thin man in his 50s and 3 teenage children. "Name's Robert Hendricks," the man introduced himself. "Used to be a school teacher back in Missouri. Heard you folks were building a town. Figured you might need someone to teach the children." Sarah's face lit up. "A school? Joshua, we could have a real school." "Can you pay?" Hendricks asked. "I don't need much, just enough to feed my kids and keep a roof over our heads." "We'll figure something out," Joshua said. "Right now we've got a dozen children running around with no education. That needs to change." They gave Hendricks one of the new cabins being built and promised to construct a schoolhouse by fall. Emma volunteered to help teach the younger children. Tommy was skeptical about the whole enterprise until Hendricks told him schools had maps of the whole world, and then the boy was convinced. As summer deepened, the settlement took shape. What started as Joshua's lonely ranch became a cluster of cabins, then a proper community. Someone suggested they needed a name. Bennett's Landing, Doc Abernathy proposed. After Thomas, he started this whole thing in a way. If he hadn't documented Wallace's crimes, none of us would be here. Sarah wiped her eyes and nodded. Thomas would have liked that. But the growth brought new challenges. A fight broke out between 2 families over water rights. Someone's cattle kept breaking into someone else's garden. The Krugers' oldest daughter got pregnant by one of the Johnson boys, and both families were furious. Joshua found himself settling disputes he'd never imagined having to settle. Was this really what he'd signed up for? Being a judge without a courthouse? A lawman without a badge? A leader without wanting to lead? One night, frustrated after a particularly ugly argument about fence lines, he told Sarah he was done. "Let them sort out their own problems. I'm not a politician. I'm not a judge. I'm just a man who wanted to live quietly." "No, you're not." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "You're a man who saved a widow and her children because it was the right thing to do. You're a man who fought corruption because someone needed to. You're a man these people look up to because you've proven yourself worthy of it." "I don't want to be worthy. I just want to go back to being alone and miserable, to chop wood and wait to die." Sarah took his face in her hands. "Joshua, you're alive again. Really alive. Don't you dare retreat back into that shell because leadership is hard. People are hard. Yes, they are, but they're also worth it. Those children learning to read. Those families building homes. That future we're creating, it's messy and complicated and frustrating, but it matters. You matter. Joshua pulled her close, buried his face in her hair. I don't know if I can do this. You don't have to do it alone. That's the whole point of community. She was right, and Joshua knew it. But knowing something and accepting it were different things. The breaking point came in late August. A group of newcomers arrived, 5 men and 2 women, led by a man named Garrett, who'd been a bounty hunter before the war. They claimed land on the eastern edge of the settlement and immediately started causing problems. Drunk and disorderly, fighting with neighbors, making crude comments to the women. Joshua warned them twice to settle down or leave. They ignored him. The third time, Garrett showed up at Joshua's door, drunk and belligerent. Who made you king? Garrett sneered. You don't own this land. You don't make the rules. No one's king, Joshua said, keeping his voice level. But we've got rules everyone agreed to. No fighting, no stealing, no threatening families. You've broken all 3. Or what, you'll make us leave? Garrett laughed. You and what army? Behind Joshua, Sarah stepped out with his rifle. Him and this army. The other families had gathered: the Johnsons, the Krugers, the Mendozas, Doc Abernathy, Sheriff Thompson, all armed, all standing together. You've got until morning to pack your things, Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. After that, we escort you out, by force if necessary. Garrett looked at the assembled crowd, calculating his odds. Smart enough to know he was beaten, he spat at Joshua's feet and stalked off. They were gone by dawn. After that, something changed in the settlement. People stopped questioning Joshua's authority because they understood it didn't come from him, it came from them. They'd chosen to follow, chosen to support, chosen to build together. By autumn, Bennett's Landing had 40 families. They'd built a proper schoolhouse, a general store run by a widow from Denver, and a smithy operated by an Irish immigrant named O'Brien. Sheriff Thompson had a small office that doubled as a jail, though they'd only used it twice. The territorial governor visited in September, bringing surveyors and official paperwork. He walked through the settlement with Joshua and Sarah nodding approvingly. This is what Montana needs, he said. Not mining camps that disappear when the gold runs out. Real towns, real communities, people invested in the future. We're doing our best, Sarah said. You're doing more than that. You're setting an example. The governor turned to Joshua. I meant what I said in my letter. Montana needs leaders like you. Have you thought about running for territorial legislature? Joshua nearly choked. Absolutely not. Why not? Because I'm a rancher who can barely read legal documents. I've got no business in government. You've got integrity and courage. That's rarer than education. The governor smiled. Think about it. The territory's changing. We need people who'll fight for settlers, not just mining interests and railroads. After the governor left, Joshua turned to Sarah. Please tell me you're not going to encourage this. I think you'd be good at it. Sarah, I'm not saying you have to, but I'm also not saying you shouldn't. She took his hand. Joshua, a year ago you were alone in a cabin waiting to die. Look at what you've built. Look at what we've built. Maybe the governor's right. Maybe you could do the same thing on a bigger scale. Or maybe I could just focus on being a good husband and father and let someone else save the territory. Sarah laughed. That's a fair point. They compromised. Joshua agreed to consider it, but not decide until after winter. If Bennett's Landing survived its first brutal Montana winter, if the community held together when things got hard, then maybe he'd think about a bigger role. Winter came early and harsh. Snow fell in October and didn't stop until March. They lost 2 families who couldn't handle the isolation and cold, but the others pulled together, sharing food, fuel, and warmth. The schoolhouse became a gathering place where people told stories and sang songs and remembered they weren't alone. Tommy's breathing stayed strong through the winter. The medicine from Denver had arrived in November, and Doc Abernathy administered it faithfully. The boy still wheezed on bad days, but nothing like before. Emma turned 13 and started helping Hendrix teach the younger children. She had a gift for it, patient and clear in her explanations. Sarah watched her daughter bloom with pride, so fierce it hurt. On a February night, when the snow was too deep to travel and the wind howled like wolves, Sarah went into labor. Joshua had delivered calves and foals, but never a human baby. He was terrified. Doc Abernathy was snowed in at the Kruger place 2 miles away and unreachable in the storm. "You can do this," Sarah told him between contractions. "Joshua, look at me. You can do this." "I don't know what I'm doing?" "Neither do I. It's my first time giving birth." Sarah managed a pained laugh. "We'll figure it out together." Emma boiled water. Tommy stayed out of the way but kept watch at the window, as if willing Doc Abernathy to appear through the storm. Joshua held Sarah's hand and tried to remember everything his mother had told him about birthing back when he was a boy on a farm in Ohio. The labor lasted 8 hours. Just before dawn, when Joshua was certain something had gone terribly wrong, Sarah gave one final push, and a baby's cry filled the cabin. A girl, small but healthy, with Sarah's dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly. Joshua wrapped her in a clean blanket, his hands shaking so badly he could barely tie the knot. When he placed the baby in Sarah's arms, he saw tears streaming down her face. "She's perfect," Sarah whispered. "Joshua, she's perfect." Emma and Tommy crowded close, staring at their new sister with wonder. The baby yawned, opened her eyes, and seemed to look directly at Joshua. Something in his chest cracked open, something that had been frozen since he'd buried his son 3 years ago. He was a father again. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something new and precious and terrifying. "What should we name her?" Sarah asked. Joshua thought of his wife dead these 3 years. Thought of how she'd wanted a daughter, had picked out names before she got sick. Grace. She'd wanted to name a daughter Grace. "Grace," he said softly. "If that's all right with you." Sarah smiled through her tears. "Grace Bennett Miller. It's perfect." Doc Abernathy arrived 2 hours later, breaking through the snowdrifts, and found them all asleep. Sarah with the baby on her chest, Joshua slumped in a chair beside them, Emma and Tommy curled on the floor nearby. "Well," Doc said to no one in particular, "looks like you managed fine without me." Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted, the creeks ran high, and green returned to the world. Bennett's Landing had survived its first winter, and something about that survival had forged the settlement into a real community. More families arrived with the thaw. A carpenter from Pennsylvania, a doctor who'd lost his practice to debt back east, a preacher who'd been traveling through and decided to stay. The settlement was becoming a real town. In April, a delegation from Helena arrived with an offer. Montana Territory was preparing for statehood. They needed representatives who understood frontier life, who could speak for settlers instead of just mining interests. They wanted Joshua Miller to run for the territorial legislature. Joshua stood on his porch, Grace asleep against his shoulder, and looked at the town he'd helped build. At the school where Emma taught. At the houses where families lived without fear. At Sarah tending her garden with Tommy's help. "What do you think?" he asked Sarah later that night. "I think you'll do whatever's right. You always do." "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." Sarah took Grace, began nursing her. "Joshua, I can't tell you whether to do this. It has to be your choice. But I will say this. You've already changed so many lives. Imagine what you could do with an official voice. A vote. Real power to make things better. Or I could fail. Could compromise too much. Could become another politician who forgets where he came from." "You won't. You're not built that way." Sarah looked up at him. "But if you're really worried, then don't do it. Stay here. build fences and raise cattle and watch your daughter grow up. That's not a small thing, Joshua. That's everything. He thought about it for days, prayed about it, though he wasn't sure he believed in prayer anymore. Talked to Doc Abernathy and Sheriff Thompson and the other families. Everyone had opinions, but none of them could make the decision for him. Finally, standing at Thomas Bennett's grave, they'd buried him properly once the ground thawed. Joshua found his answer. "I can't bring you back," he said to the marker. "Can't undo what happened. But I can make sure it means something. Make sure other families don't face what Sarah and the children faced. That's worth fighting for. That's worth the risk." He rode to Helena the next week and accepted the nomination. The campaign would be hard, the election uncertain. But for the first time since his family died, Joshua Miller had a purpose that extended beyond survival. He was building something that would outlast him. Something good. And in the end, that was enough. The campaign nearly destroyed him. Joshua had thought fighting Wallace and Brennan was hard. Thought building a community from nothing was hard. But politics was a different kind of warfare, one he wasn't prepared for. His opponent was Clayton Mercer, a lawyer from Butte with deep pockets and deeper connections to the mining interests. Mercer was smooth, where Joshua was rough. Eloquent, where Joshua was plain-spoken. He had newspapers backing him, money flowing from San Francisco investors, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Miller's a vigilante," Mercer told crowds in Helena. "A man who takes the law into his own hands. Do we really want someone like that making our laws?" Joshua countered the only way he knew how with truth. He traveled from town to town, speaking in saloons and church halls, telling his story. Telling Sarah's story. Telling the story of families crushed by corruption and greed. "Montana's changing," he told a crowd in Virginia City. "We can change toward justice and fairness, or we can change toward whoever has the most money and the least conscience. That's the choice, not between me and Mercer, between what kind of territory we want to be." But truth didn't always win against money. Mercer's campaign bought endorsements from newspapers, paid for rallies that drew hundreds. They dug into Joshua's past, found the story about his resignation, as Marshall twisted it into a narrative about a man who abandoned his duty. "He couldn't protect his own family," one article read. "How can he protect Montana?" Sarah found him reading that article, crumpling it in his fist, fighting tears of rage and grief. "Don't," she said, taking the paper from him. "Don't let them make you ashamed of surviving. They're using my dead wife and son as a campaign weapon. They're desperate. That means you're winning." Sarah pulled him close. "Joshua, you're scaring them. Men like Mercer, like Wallace used to be, they're terrified of people who can't be bought or intimidated. So they go after what hurts most. Your heart, your losses, the things that made you human. Maybe I should withdraw. Focus on Bennett's Landing. Let someone else fight this fight. Is that what you want?" Joshua looked at her, this woman who'd faced down hired killers and corrupt judges, who'd testified in court with her voice shaking but never breaking. "No. But I don't want to put you and the children through this either. We're already through it. The question is whether we see it to the end." Sarah's grip tightened. "Joshua, we've fought too hard to quit now. Thomas died fighting corruption. You nearly died fighting it. We don't get to stop just because it gets uncomfortable." So Joshua kept campaigning, kept speaking truth to crowds that sometimes cheered and sometimes jeered. Sarah traveled with him when she could, Grace strapped to her chest, telling her own story about what happened when power went unchecked. Emma and Tommy stayed in Bennett's Landing with Doc Abernathy, and every night Joshua felt the guilt of being an absent father. He'd promised himself after losing his first family that he'd never prioritize work over family again. Yet here he was doing exactly that. "It's temporary," Sarah reminded him during a rare night together. "A few months of absence for a lifetime of change. The children understand." "Do they?" "Emma does. She told me she's proud of you. Said you're fighting for people who can't fight for themselves, just like you fought for us." "And Tommy?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Tommy misses you. But he also drew a picture of you standing in front of a big building labeled Territory House. He knows what you're doing matters. The election was set for November. By October, the campaign had become brutal. Mercer's people spread rumors that Joshua was secretly working for competing mining interests, that he'd taken bribes, that his marriage to Sarah was a scandal because they'd been living together before they wed. She was a widow and he was unmarried. One newspaper editorial sneered, "Living together alone in the wilderness. One wonders what really transpired before their hasty marriage." That one sent Sarah into a cold fury Joshua had never seen before. She wrote a response and paid to have it published in every newspaper that would print it. "Mr. Mercer's campaign questions my virtue and my husband's honor because they cannot question his record or his character. They imply impropriety because they cannot prove corruption. They attack a family because they cannot defeat ideas. To anyone reading this who has ever been desperate, ever been alone, ever been saved by someone's unexpected kindness, you know the truth. Decency exists, honor exists, and it terrifies men like Clayton Mercer because they cannot buy it, cannot control it, cannot understand it." The letter caused a firestorm. Half the territory praised her courage. The other half condemned her audacity, a woman speaking publicly about politics, about her own reputation. Improper, unseemly, unladylike. Sarah didn't care. She started speaking at Joshua's rallies, telling her story, answering attacks directly. Women came to hear her in numbers that surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. "We don't have the vote," one woman told Sarah after a speech. "But our husbands do, and they listen to us more than they admit." 3 weeks before the election disaster struck, a fire swept through Bennett's Landing schoolhouse, destroying it completely. No one was injured. It happened at night, but every book, every slate, every carefully accumulated supply was gone. Mercer's campaign immediately blamed Joshua. He's so focused on political ambition, he neglected his own community. The people of Bennett's Landing are suffering while Miller campaigns. Joshua wanted to abandon the campaign immediately, ride home, rebuild. But Sheriff Thompson sent a telegram that changed his mind. "Fire wasn't accidental. Found kerosene cans. This was arson. Don't come home. That's what they want you, distracted, discouraged, defeated. We'll rebuild. You finish what you started." The next day, donations started arriving in Bennett's Landing. Lumber from sympathetic merchants, books from teachers across the territory, money from families who'd heard Sarah's story and wanted to help. Within a week, they had enough supplies to rebuild twice over. "Your opponents meant to destroy your community," Doc Abernathy wrote in a letter. "Instead, they unified the entire territory behind it. Even people who don't support your politics are supporting the rebuild. They picked the wrong target." The final debate was held in Helena a week before the election. 200 people crowded into the territorial hall. Mercer arrived in an expensive suit with an entourage of advisors. Joshua arrived alone, wearing his one good shirt and the same coat he'd worn the day he saved Sarah. The moderator asked about economic policy, land rights, territorial expansion. Mercer gave polished answers full of statistics and legal precedents. Joshua spoke simply about families trying to build futures, about protecting settlers from the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed Bennett's Landing. Then Mercer made his mistake. "My opponent speaks eloquently about justice," Mercer said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But let's examine his record. He's a failed marshal who couldn't protect his own family, a vigilante who takes the law into his own hands, a man living on charity and other people's sympathy. Is this really who we want representing Montana Territory?" The room went silent. Joshua stood slowly, and something in his face made Mercer take a step back. "You're right," Joshua said quietly. "I failed to protect my family. My wife and son died while I was chasing outlaws who didn't matter. I've lived with that failure every day for 4 years. It hollowed me out, made me wish I'd died with them." He paused, let the words settle. "Then I heard a woman and her children being threatened. I could have ignored it, should have probably. It wasn't my business. But I went anyway, and I found a widow feeding her children scraps because corrupt officials were stealing her land. I found a system designed to crush anyone without money or power, and I decided that even though I couldn't save my own family, maybe I could save hers." Joshua looked directly at Mercer. "You call that vigilantism. I call it being human. You call it taking the law into my own hands. I call it standing up when the law itself was corrupt. You call me a failure. Maybe I am. But I'm a failure who stopped a conspiracy that would have displaced dozens of families. I'm a failure who helped build a community from nothing. I'm a failure who proved that ordinary people can fight power and win." The room had gone completely still. "So yes, Mr. Mercer, I'm flawed. I'm rough around the edges. I don't have your education or your polish or your wealthy backers. But I have something you'll never have. I know what it means to lose everything and keep fighting anyway. I know what it means to be powerless and desperate, and I'll never forget it no matter how many elections I win or lose." Joshua sat down to thunderous applause. Mercer tried to respond, but his words sounded hollow after Joshua's raw honesty. Election day came cold and clear. Joshua voted in Bennett's Landing, then spent the day helping rebuild the schoolhouse. By sunset, they'd framed the walls. By the time the polls closed, they'd raised the roof. The results came in slowly over the next 3 days as votes were counted and tallied across the vast territory. Bennett's Landing went overwhelmingly for Joshua. So did most of the small settlements. But the mining towns leaned toward Mercer, and the cities were split. On the third day, a rider arrived with a telegram from Helena. Joshua Miller, 3,847 votes. Clayton Mercer, 3,201 votes. He'd won by 646 votes out of nearly 7,000 cast. Sarah grabbed him, and they stood there in the middle of the unfinished schoolhouse, holding each other while the community cheered around them. "You did it," she whispered. "Joshua, you actually did it. We did it. All of us." That night, they gathered everyone in Bennett's Landing for a celebration. The Johnsons brought venison. The Krugers brought beer they'd been brewing. The Mendozas brought guitars and songs. Even Sheriff Thompson showed up with a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. Doc Abernathy raised a toast. To Joshua Miller, who came to Montana to die alone, and instead gave all of us a reason to live together. To Sarah Miller, someone else shouted, who proved that speaking truth is more powerful than any campaign fund. To Bennett's Landing, another voice called, the town that refused to die. They drank and sang and told stories late into the night. Emma danced with the Johnson boys. Tommy fell asleep on Joshua's lap. Grace nursed peacefully, while Sarah hummed an old song from Pennsylvania. As the celebration wound down and people drifted home, Joshua found himself standing outside with Doc Abernathy looking at the stars. "You ready for Helena?" Doc asked. "For being a legislator?" "No. But I wasn't ready to be a marshal either, or a husband the second time around, or a father again. Seems like the important things always happen before you're ready." "That's wisdom right there." Doc clapped him on the shoulder. "You're going to do good things, Joshua. Change things that need changing. Fight fights that need fighting. Or I'll compromise too much and accomplish nothing." "Possible, but I doubt it. You're too stubborn to quit and too honest to sell out. That's a rare combination." Inside the cabin, Sarah was putting the children to bed. Joshua watched through the window. His wife, his daughter, his stepchildren, who'd become his own. A family built from grief and chance and stubborn hope. 4 years ago, he'd been a broken man, waiting to die in a cabin that held nothing but ghosts. Now, he was a husband, father, community leader, and territorial legislator. The loneliness that had nearly consumed him was just a memory. He thought about Thomas Bennett, who died trying to fight corruption. Thought about his first wife and son gone, but not forgotten. Thought about all the people who'd suffered because no one with power cared enough to help. "I won't let you down," he said quietly to the stars, to the memories, to the future. "Any of you." The territorial legislature convened in January. Joshua left Bennett's Landing on a cold morning, Sarah and the children seeing him off. Grace cried when he mounted his horse. Tommy tried to be brave. Emma hugged him tight and whispered, "Make us proud." "I'll try." Helena was bigger than he remembered, busier, noisier. The legislative hall was filled with men in expensive suits who looked at Joshua like he was a curiosity, the rough frontiersman who'd somehow won a seat at the table. But there were others, too. A rancher from the Eastern Plains, a farmer from the Flathead Valley, a former Buffalo soldier who'd homesteaded near the Yellowstone, working people who'd been elected by other working people to change a system that had never cared about them. The first battle was over land reform. The mining interests wanted to keep the old system where companies could claim massive parcels and push out settlers. Joshua and his allies fought for a bill that would limit corporate landholdings and protect homesteaders. "These companies employ thousands," one legislator argued. "They're the backbone of our economy." "And the families being displaced," Joshua shot back. "What about them? Where's their backbone supposed to come from when they've lost everything?" The debates were fierce. Joshua learned quickly that politics was about compromise, about making deals and building coalitions. Some days he felt like he was betraying his principles. Other days he felt like he was actually changing things. They passed a watered-down land reform bill that did less than Joshua wanted, but more than the corporations feared. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat either. It was progress, slow and frustrating and real. Between legislative sessions, Joshua returned to Bennett's Landing. Each time the town had grown. New families, new buildings. A second school opened. The general store expanded. Someone started a newspaper. "You're missing your children growing up," Sarah told him during one visit home. Grace was walking now, taking wobbly steps and laughing when she fell. Tommy was reading at a 6th grade level, despite being only 9. Emma had started courting one of the Johnson boys, though she denied it vehemently. "I know," Joshua said, the guilt sharp as always. "Maybe I should resign, focus on family. Maybe you should stop second-guessing yourself." Sarah's tone was gentle but firm. "Joshua, you're doing important work. The children understand that. Grace won't remember these years of absence, and Tommy and Emma are proud of you. Stop torturing yourself." "I just don't want to make the same mistake twice. Don't want to miss what matters while chasing what seems important." "You're not making the same mistake. Last time you didn't have a choice, you didn't know your family was sick. This time we're all healthy. We're all safe. We're all choosing this together. There's a difference." Over the next 3 years, Joshua and his coalition passed bills protecting workers' rights, establishing public education funding, and creating territorial parks. They fought off attempts to privatize water rights and beat back legislation that would have let railroads seize land without fair compensation. Mercer ran against him in the next election. Lost by a wider margin. Bennett's Landing became a model for sustainable settlement. Other communities copied their shared resource system, their community decision-making, their focus on education and mutual support. Newspapers across the country wrote articles about the Montana town built on justice. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Joshua was offered a seat in the new state legislature. He declined. "I've done what I can here," he told the governor. "Time to go home. Time to be a father and husband and rancher. Time to let someone else carry the fight." He returned to Bennett's Landing in the spring, when the mountains were green and the creeks ran high with snowmelt. Sarah met him at the edge of town with Grace on her hip and tears in her eyes. "Welcome home," she said. "For good this time." That summer, they held a dedication ceremony for the new community hall. 50 families came, some original settlers, others who'd arrived in the waves that followed. They named it the Thomas Bennett Memorial Hall. Thomas started this, Sarah said during her speech, not by planning to, but by refusing to accept injustice, by documenting corruption even when it cost him everything, by believing that truth mattered more than safety. This building stands because he wouldn't kneel, because Joshua wouldn't walk away, because all of us decided that building something good was worth the fight. She unveiled a plaque on the wall. It read, "Built on the principle that ordinary people standing together can defeat any injustice. May those who gather here never forget what was sacrificed to create this place, and may they always have the courage to fight for what's right." That night, Joshua sat on his porch with Sarah, watching the sun set over mountains that had witnessed everything. Grace played at their feet. Emma and the Johnson boy sat together on the fence, trying to look casual. Tommy read a book, occasionally looking up to ask Joshua about complicated words. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Everything that happened, the fighting, the pain, the years of struggle." Joshua thought about that day 4 years ago when he'd heard gunfire and made a choice to get involved. Thought about everything that choice had cost and everything it had created. "No," he said finally. "I regret the years I spent alone waiting to die. I regret not finding you sooner. But everything after that first gunshot, everything we built together, no regrets at all." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad it was you, that day at my cabin. I'm glad it was you who came." "Me too." Years passed. Grace grew into a fierce, independent girl who reminded everyone of her mother. Tommy became a teacher, taking over the Bennett's Landing School when Hendricks retired. Emma married the Johnson boy and had 4 children of her own. More settlers came, drawn by the story of a town built on justice and community. Bennett's Landing became a small city with churches and schools and businesses that stretched for blocks. But it never forgot its founding principles, that people mattered more than profit, that justice was worth fighting for, that ordinary courage could change the world. Joshua and Sarah grew old together, their hands weathered by work, their faces lined by laughter and hardship in equal measure. They sat on that same porch, year after year, watching their community thrive, watching their family expand, watching the world change. On a spring morning, when Joshua was 63, Sarah found him in the barn, brushing down his old horse, the same gelding that had carried them through that first terrible blizzard. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" she asked. "When you first came to the cabin. Get your things, you're coming home." "I didn't understand at the time what you meant by home. I thought you meant your cabin, a temporary shelter." Sarah moved closer. "But you didn't mean a building, did you?" "No." Joshua's voice was soft. "I meant something bigger, something we'd build together. Not just walls and a roof, but a place where people belonged, where they were safe, where they mattered." "We built it," Sarah said. "Not just for us, but for hundreds of families. We built home." Joshua pulled her close, this woman who'd changed his life by needing his help. "Couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." They stood together in the warm barn, surrounded by the sounds of a living, breathing community they'd created from nothing but stubbornness and hope. Outside, children played in streets where once there'd been only wilderness. Families laughed in homes where once there'd been only survival. Justice lived where once corruption had ruled. Joshua Miller had come to Montana to die alone. Instead, he'd learned to live again, had built a family, a community, a legacy, had proven that one person's decision to care, to act, to fight could change everything. The promised land wasn't a place you found. It was people you fought beside and the home you built after the storm. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.